What does being lost feel like? You know, I was on my journey on Tuesday of last week, Tuesday afternoon after work. I laced up my boots, I removed my backpack, and then I rode on my foot 6 miles around the loop of Gainesville. And this lady on my walk, I was about a mile in, and she was on a bike. She's coming downhill, I'm coming uphill. She stops. She looks at me. I have headphones in, uninterested in any type of activity other than getting to my final destination. Well, she stops me on her bike. She says, "Stop, stop." And I pause, I take out my earphones and I say, "Hey, how's it going?" And she says, "I'm lost." And my immediate response was, "Well, you're on 39th Avenue. And she was not expecting to be on 39th Avenue. It was actually quite sad. And she needed to get to Plato's Closet ASAP. And so the best way for her to get to Plato's Closet was for her to turn around from where she had come from and go further than where she went before. And she got frustrated, not at me, she was frustrated more so at the circumstance. She didn't have a phone or anything, and she came to me helpless. She said, "I am lost." It got me thinking, when was the last time were we truly lost? You know, if you're listening to this, you have a working phone or a working computer. You have access to the internet. You have access to a map. Directionally, it's difficult to get truly lost. You know, I was talking to my mother this weekend, and she shared that she was lost, and I think that was more to do with service than anything, but I'll share that story in just a couple minutes. Back to this lady. It is fascinating. You know, sometimes we think we're headed in the right direction. For this woman, she was headed north on, I'm not even going to try directions. I'm directionally challenged, so I'm not going to try it. But she was headed toward Plato's Closet to begin with. Then she didn't know how to get there. She turned around. That's when she met me. She biked about another 2 miles. She met me. And I share with her, the best way to get to Plato's Closet is to go back from where you came from, then turn right on to Northwest 34th Street. That'll take you straight there. But you see, she didn't make it to Northwest 34th Street the first time. She made it to Northwest 43rd Street. And I think there's a lesson there in many ways, is if we just keep pushing further, you don't know what's on the other side of Northwest 43rd Street. You don't know what's on the other side. And sometimes life can feel directionless, and life can feel like you've got a plan. You want to stick to the plan, but then you give up on the plan because it feels like a failure, but really you just haven't opened the next door that the Lord has in store for you. You know, how do we get to that point? And for this young lady, well, respectfully, she wasn't that young, so I would want to tell the truth and be quite frank with you all. But for this lady, she had to humble herself. She had to put her pride aside and say, "Look, I'm lost. I need help." And because she was willing to do that, she was able to reach her destination. Imagine how humility can open up the door. Think about that for a moment. And I hope she reached her destination. She biked a long ways and she was frustrated at herself. And on to my mother, I spoke with her on Saturday. She paid me, Jackson, and Julia, who is Jackson's girlfriend, who we've talked about before. Significant other, excuse me. They are dating, just for the record, but previously we shared that they were each other's significant other. So we will hold to that. And if you're wondering who we are, because you only hear one voice, it would be Brett Walters. Again, I'm not sure if you know who that is, but we miss him. We miss him dearly. We miss him deeply and generously. So we'll see him soon, maybe one day. Anyway, she was sharing that she got lost on her journey to Sarasota, and there was a wreck and there was an accident, and her phone, which she was using to navigate, said, to avoid the wreck or accident, go this way. Well, she went that way, then she ran out of service. Now, what happens when you run out of service? Your phone stops giving direction. You become directionless. Well, where did this lead my mother? This led my mother to what she proclaimed as one of the great and most beautiful places in all of the southeastern United States, Miranda. I think that's the name. And it's lagoon-like, beautiful water, almost Greek buildings, palm trees, absolutely glorious. And so you never know what's on the other side of the directions. Now, I'm not saying this is not a lesson to live your life aimlessly, but as we discussed last week, sometimes we have to be dependent on things other than ourselves. And when we put our pride aside and we put our desire to be successful aside and say, look, I need help. And I'm preaching to myself here, just FYI. Look, I need help. It opens up the door for a next step that moves us closer to glory. And so I hope that's encouraging to you. This week, we played our upward game as promised, and we lost. You know, I was frustrated at the referees for a moment. They made some calls I disagreed with slightly. But you know what they say, you don't make up the decision of the game by bad calls. It's by bad coaching. So I accept the failure. I really do. It's a sad failure, but at the end of the day, is it really a failure? You know, you may have not won by the world standards through score, but have you grown children to love the game of basketball and to glorify God on the court and to support their teammates? Make them better children. I hope I've contributed to that. I guess parents would have to have the final say there. Anyway, it was a fun day. You know, we had the weekend off. It's Martin Luther King Jr. Day as well. And the national championship in CAA 2026. It was a great game. Miami versus the Hoosiers. You know, I was rooting for Indiana, and they pulled it off. And Fernando Mendoza, if you haven't looked him up, look him up. But that team, they exemplified discipline to me. You know, I love D'Angelo Pons and his story. He's the cornerback. But I'm just going to be honest. It was a great time watching together. It was me, Jackson, my brother, Evan, Brandon, and Connor were their names. And we had Milton Bakery donuts and buffalo chicken dip. And you may be listening to this and thinking, you are crazy. That's a horrendous combo. And I would play the contrarian to your horrendous opinion. Because quite frankly, it's hard to beat. It is. It really is. And if you've never had a Milton Bakery donut and you're listening to this, I would look it up. You know, they won the Florida's best donut in the world. I believe that's an award. Florida's best donut in the world, and I'm proud of them. And so I celebrate that, and I celebrated with multiple donuts yesterday evening. To be frank, yesterday evening being Monday, I'm recording this on Tuesday evening. To be frank with you, I woke up in a fog, and that's okay. You know, you make compromises in life, and the compromise was enjoy Milton Bakery donuts and have brain fog, or don't enjoy bakery donuts and enjoy your sleep. And I prioritize the donuts. I think there's a little something to be said there is, sometimes we hold too strictly that we forget to live. That's how I would put it. And I just want to celebrate life. I'd encourage you to enjoy life. The Bible teaches to enjoy life. If what you're doing is causing you to hate your life, that is not the vision for Scripture. That's not the vision for the Christian life. There are things you will not like to do and things that you will question. But I believe God aligns our hearts 100% over time through the process of sanctification to adhere to the will of God. And that's exactly what we talked about on Sunday morning, is how do we, and on this topic of specifically generosity, not generosity with our time and talents, but generosity with our finances, on that topic specifically, which can be a taboo topic, but a good topic to discuss. It's a huge piece of the Christian life, is how do we use our money? Not just tithing, not just offering to the church, but how do you budget your money? How do you spend money? What are you spending money on? If you asked, do you audit your life like a person or a company would come audit your organization? Do you have an account of your bills? I believe, to put it in parliamentary terms, do you have the Bill of Rights? Frankly, I think that's a stretch, but what are we doing if we're not stretching? Speaking of stretching, I hit legs on Sunday, and it was painful. Then I went into the sauna, and there was you never know what you're going to see in the sauna. And what I saw was a hairy, elderly man lying down on the first bench. And it was an interesting experience. You have the top shelf, which is the hot shelf, meaning it's the hottest place in the sauna. So if you want to get your sweat on, that's where you want to go. That's where I went. I wanted to be drenched in sweat by the time I was done. This gentleman wanted to slow burn, and he decided, let me lie on the bench where people put their buttocks, their sweaty buttocks at that, and I'm going to lie on my back, full stretch, and I'm just going to be here. And so I love it for him. He has no shame, and I think that's a beautiful thing. I think it might be against the rules of the sauna, but I'm not the rule enforcer of the sauna. That's not my job. I was not delegated with that task. And so I celebrate him and his desire to be who he is. And I think that's bad biblical advice, but sauna advice, sometimes you got to make that move. Speaking of things getting hot, I recorded a video with Brian Harrington making a pizza. And when I say things getting hot, I mean the oven. The oven was set at 450 degrees. It was a salmon pizza. And you're going to see a video soon about that. Not on the Quite Frankly podcast, but on the Night to Shine social media, which I'm excited for. That's happening February 6th here in Gainesville. Night to Shine is a special needs prom, and it's an opportunity to love people with developmental disabilities, make them kings and queens. It really is one of the great nights of the year, and I'm looking forward to it. But that video was a lot of fun to make, and I'll just tell you straight up, I'm going to spoil it for you listeners, just to give you a behind-the-scenes look, but we made a salmon pizza, or an Alaskan pizza. And it's kind of a competitor to the Hawaiian with the ham and the pineapple. The Alaskan pizza takes the ham and the pineapple and turns it into salmon and syrup and maybe a little sriracha and sour worms. It It was interesting in taste. It was interesting in taste. You know, there's a little, well, sour. There was sweet, and there was fish. Would I recommend it? Would I sell it at a restaurant? Not a normal. I wouldn't do it at Pizza Hut, but if there was a specialty, like we make weird pizzas at this restaurant, I would sell it there. And I think there'd be a market for it. But I want you to watch the video and let me know what you think later. It's going to be pretty powerful. And we did that because 5 Star Pizza of Gainesville, shout out to them, they're giving 20% of all sales tonight to Shine on Tuesday, January 27th. I think that's pretty exciting, and it makes me think of a time with the Unity Party where we raised $27 and gave it tonight to Shine. And it's just beautiful to see how the people of a movement come together to support another fantastic movement. And I like to call that cross-moving, is we are together, united, seeking to create a nation and a world where life can flourish. And we believe Night to Shine is one of those ways that supports that cause. So we want to give to it. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And there's a lot to be said there. And speaking of supporting others, that's kind of what we talked about in Life Group is Mark chapter 9 is what we discussed, verses 30 through 50 specifically. And Jesus is talking to the disciples, and he's talking about how important it is to go after and to welcome the people of lowly status. In their culture, in their time, and frankly, in specific areas, our culture and our time, we value status, we value equity in the world. How are we viewed? Are we viewed as successful? Do I have a good job? Do I have a good life? Do I have a home? Do I have a wife? Do I have kids? And you view that kind of as this American dream utopia. It's funny how context changed, because back in their day, children were viewed kind of as an inconvenience. They weren't a great status symbol. And so when Jesus says, go after the low children and welcome them in, the little children and welcome them in, it's important to think about that in the context, in the terms of these people are viewed as inconveniences and the people that you may not want to be around. Same thing with the disciples. Their status in the world was lowly. And Jesus took them in. Jesus goes after the lowly. And he was clear. He talked about the severity of sin in Matthew about the self, right? If this causes you to sin, if your eye causes you to sin, cut it out. Well, in Mark, he says, if your eye causes another person to sin, cut it out. And I think there's something beautiful there, is the importance of the severity of sin surrounding us and other people. And we have a responsibility when we accept Jesus. Now my responsibility is I am not going to make my brother stumble. I'm not going to put him in a position to stumble. I'm not going to put my sister in a position to stumble. That's my commitment, and that's part of following Jesus. But in a world filled with idols, and I specifically, meaning I am the one in charge of my life, I do things for me, I am the biggest priority in my life. That's how the world operates, tends to. That's difficult. And I think we'd be lying to ourselves if we said it was easy. And I think that's a trap, to be honest. But we have a great responsibility to care deeply for our brothers and sisters in the Lord, because it is severe when we sin. There's a war going on. There's a war of Satan and God. If you are for us, anyone who is not against us is for us. Anyone who is for us is not against us. You're either for God or you're against God. It's pretty simple, black and white. There's no gray. And I think if you're for God, not really I think, I know if you're for God, then we have a commitment to Jesus, that we're going to glorify him no matter the circumstance. And hear me when I say this. We're not going to be perfect. I can tell you I'm not perfect. I've failed every day. And I think that's the beauty of the gospel, is the grace and the mercy abounds more than we could ever think, ask, or imagine. But we have to ask, we have to accept, we have to strive. And that's not based out of a motivation to please those around you, or even motivation to get Jesus' favor or approval in your life. That motivation must come from a deep love and honor for Jesus, and an understanding that we literally, humans, exist for God's pleasure and glory. He wants to delight in you, the creator of the universe. Can you imagine that? I think that's quite encouraging. And it makes you view him as a father, a loving father. And you can't get enough father imagery when it comes to God. I'm convinced, at least in America. Well, I'm not going to speak. That's too much of a generalization. Quite frankly, at least for me, I can't get enough imagery of that, because it's so beautiful and it's captivating, and it makes you want to step into something beautiful, a beautiful relationship. And so if you have any questions about that, Rodrigo's going to be out in the chat boards and message boards, and just feel free to hit him up and he'll connect us with you, and we'd love to chat. It's one of my deep passions of life. It's one of the things that fuel me and get me excited, is to talk about Jesus. And I'm no expert. Hear me when I say that. But I'll tell you what, I love talking about him. He's amazing. Well, on Friday, it was pretty chill, you know. I'm talking about Thursday. On Thursday, we played basketball in the morning. We have our life group basketball, and some guys get together at 5:30, play basketball. Then we work, and then 5:30 p.m. rolls around. So basketball's a.m., 5:30 p.m. rolls around. We hit up pickleball. And 8:30 p.m. rolls around. We hit up, it's coming, Los Margaritas. It's been quite some time since I've talked about that place, and I used to go, I used to go maybe once a month. That stopped. And I was reminded this past Thursday how beautiful of an organization that is. Chicken Jalisco. I used to say double rice, no beans. This time I did rice, black beans, not refried beans. And I think that's the play in the future. It gets a little more fiber going. And it was a great squad. So it's some of my friends. Their names are actually 2 A's, 1 D, Adam, Ashton, and Dylan. And so that was fun, and I celebrate that. And if you ever want to join that and you're listening to this, you just reach out again to the message board, the chat boards, to Rodrigo, and he'd be happy to get you connected. Well, I hope this has been helpful. I hope this idea of lostness is not something you walk away with and say, how do I get lost? It is a promise that we were once lost and now we're found. We sometimes have to go further than we expect, and it's going to be hard, and it's going to be tough, and you don't want to do it. But what's going to happen is Jesus is going to show up. He's going to show up just as he did on your journey, and he's pushing you closer to him with every step of the way. And usually the things we don't want to do, but we know we have to, push us closer to Jesus. And we celebrate that. And maybe you're that person in somebody else's life. Maybe you need someone in your life to push you closer. Again, Rodrigo, he's going to be monitoring the chats 24/7. He's going to reach out to us so we can know how to love you more deeply and more generously. And let me leave you with this quickly. 2 things. If you have any merch, 3 things, excuse me. Get some merch. It supports the podcast. And you may be saying, well, Bo, you haven't done a podcast except last week. You hadn't done one in 5 months. Why would I support this? And I think that's a fair pushback, and I don't really have a great rebuttal to that comment. But I love you. I can tell you that much. Secondly, would you rate or review us? And please don't say anything like, they're kind of hit and miss. They don't do podcasts. They used to do it all the time. Now you have no idea when they're doing it. Please don't write that. Maybe write a 5-star review and lie if you need to. That's totally fine. And finally, I was listening to this song. It's called To Worship You I Live. I think that's a great song. You should listen to it. It's by Grace City and Michael Delgado. But it's the words of it. By his will and for his pleasure, I exist. I think this is, don't let me put things on you that aren't necessarily true, but I think we tend to think by our will and for my pleasure, I exist. That's how we operate. Maybe that's not how we think. That's how we tend to operate. That's a natural human condition. It's understandable. It's how we're trained. But I think it's quite beautiful. By his will, for his pleasure, I exist. To worship you, I live. Give it a listen. Again, let Rodrigo know. He'll be on the chat boards. And until next time, my friend, I love you. Brett loves you. He does. And Rodrigo, we three love you deeply and generously. And we're going to see you back on the Quite Frankly podcast.